Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. Luke Reynolds had always lived by a simple philosophy. Mind your own business and life will mind its own. His farm, a sprawling piece of land passed down through 3 generations, was more than just a livelihood. It was a legacy. The scent of fresh soil in the morning, the sound of cows lazily chewing grass, and the sight of golden fields stretching to the horizon were all he ever needed. He had no interest in city life, fancy cars, or the modern world beyond the occasional trip into town for supplies. His world was peaceful, that is, until the HOA moved in next door 5 years ago. Evergreen Estates had been nothing but a quiet patch of land, the kind that people drove past without a second thought. Then came the developers, promising luxury, exclusivity, and the perfect suburban experience. Row after row of identical pastel-colored houses sprung up like weeds, each with a neatly manicured lawn and a 3-car garage. Luke had never cared much about his new neighbors. They had their world, and he had his. Unfortunately, Olivia Masters, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, didn't see it that way. The first time she showed up on Luke's farm, he was out on his porch, sipping his morning coffee and watching the sunrise. He spotted her marching up his driveway with the kind of determination that usually meant trouble. Dressed in an immaculate beige pantsuit and clipboard in hand, she carried herself like a general heading into battle. Luke didn't need to be a genius to know what was coming. He had heard enough stories about HOAs to recognize their type from a mile away. "You must be Mr. Reynolds," she said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Luke took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "That's me. I'm Olivia Masters, president of the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association. I'd like to have a quick word about your property." He arched an eyebrow. "Didn't know my farm had anything to do with Evergreen Estates." Her smile tightened. "Technically it doesn't, but your land borders our community, and, as I'm sure you understand, property values are a delicate matter." Luke nearly laughed out loud. He had lived here long before Evergreen Estates even existed, and now this woman was trying to tell him his farm was a problem. He set his mug down and leaned back in his chair. "That's so." Olivia straightened her clipboard and cleared her throat as if preparing for a well-rehearsed speech. "We've received multiple complaints about your property's appearance. The bright red color of your barn is quite striking. A neutral tone would blend better with the community aesthetic. Then there's the issue of noise. Your rooster, for example. Some of our residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise, which is quite disruptive." Luke blinked, unsure if she was being serious. His barn had been red since his grandfather built it. As for the rooster, well, that was just nature doing its thing. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly, rubbing his chin. "You want me to change the color of my barn and somehow convince a rooster to hit the snooze button because your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Olivia smiled tightly. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Luke sighed, stretching his arms. "Well, Miss Masters, I appreciate you stopping by, but my farm isn't part of your HOA. I don't answer to your rules. And as far as I can tell, my land, my barn, and my animals aren't hurting anyone." Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she said before turning sharply on her heel and marching back to her car. Luke watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, but something told him Olivia was going to be a whole different kind of problem. It didn't take long for her to prove him right. Within a week, Luke started receiving letters. Official-looking notices on HOA letterhead demanding that he comply with neighborhood standards. He chuckled as he tossed them into the trash. Then came the complaints, calls to the county about supposed zoning violations, noise disturbances, and health hazards. Inspectors started showing up unannounced, but each time they found nothing wrong. At first, Luke brushed it off. People like Olivia thrived on control, and without any real power over him. She was just making noise. But then she took things a step further. One morning, he woke up to find a group of HOA hired workers installing a fence on his land. Furious, he stormed over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the workers, a nervous-looking guy in a reflective vest, glanced at Olivia, who stood nearby with her ever-present clipboard. Just following orders, the worker mumbled. Olivia stepped forward, her tone smug. We're making necessary improvements to the community. This privacy fence will help maintain visual harmony. Luke's eyes darkened. On my land. Well, she said, flipping through her clipboard, there's been some debate over the exact property lines. Luke crossed his arms. Let me make something clear. You and your people have 5 minutes to pack up and leave. Otherwise, I'm calling the sheriff. The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. They weren't about to get arrested for trespassing over a fence. Olivia, however, looked furious. You're being unreasonable, Mr. Reynolds, she huffed. Luke smirked. No, ma'am, you are. With a murderous glare, Olivia signaled for her workers to pack up. The fence project was dead before it even started. Luke thought that would be the end of it, but Olivia wasn't the type to back down. A few days later, he received a new letter. This time, an official-looking document claimed that his farm was under review for possible rezoning. If successful, it would mean stricter regulations, higher taxes, and a nightmare of paperwork. Luke sighed. He had hoped Olivia would get bored and move on. But clearly, she was in it for the long haul. If she wanted a fight, he'd give her one. The letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. Luke barely glanced at them before tossing them onto the growing pile in his kitchen. The demands had escalated from aesthetic adjustments to outright threats, warnings of legal action, zoning violations, and hefty fines if he didn't comply with the HOA's so-called community standards. The funny thing was, he wasn't even part of their community. His land had been here long before Evergreen Estates, and it wasn't subject to their rules. But that didn't seem to matter to Olivia. The county inspectors arrived next, their visits becoming a near-weekly occurrence. First, it was the health department responding to a report about unsanitary animal conditions. The inspector, an older man named Tom, looked around at Luke's well-kept pens and healthy animals before shaking his head. I don't know who you pissed off, but this is the cleanest farm I've seen in months. The following week, zoning officials showed up, then someone from animal control. Each time they left empty-handed, finding no actual violations. But Olivia wasn't discouraged. If anything, she doubled down. One afternoon, Luke was out fixing the fence when he saw them. Olivia and 2 HOA board members, standing at the edge of his property, acting as if they owned the place. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, already knowing this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. You again, he said flatly. Mr. Reynolds. Olivia greeted him with a saccharine smile, as if this was just an exhausting formality rather than a battle she had willingly started. I was hoping we could handle this civilly, but you continue to ignore our requests. Luke crossed his arms. That's because your requests are ridiculous. She ignored him and handed over a document. As per HOA regulations, I'm not in your HOA. Luke interrupted, waving the paper back at her. As per HOA regulations, she repeated, her voice tightening, all properties within visual range of Evergreen Estates must adhere to community aesthetic guidelines. We are prepared to take further action if necessary. Luke let out a sharp laugh. Lady, you're not my landlord. You don't have any authority here. One of the board members, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, spoke up. We've been in contact with county officials regarding zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation of certain regulations, you may be subject to fines. Luke's amusement faded slightly. He knew his farm was in perfect compliance, but people like Olivia didn't play fair. They dug until they found something. Anything to use as leverage. Well, he said, stepping closer, you do what you have to do, but if you or anyone from your HOA steps foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing. For the first time, Olivia's expression cracked. There was a flicker of frustration before she masked it again with a tight-lipped smile. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. No, Luke said, voice steady, I think you are. He turned his back on her and walked away, knowing full well that this wouldn't be the end of it. It wasn't. The next escalation came in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped into his mailbox under the cover of darkness. The HOA logo was stamped smugly in the top left corner. Inside, The letter outlined a list of absurd violations. Unapproved exterior color, red barn clashes with neighborhood aesthetics, excessive noise pollution, rooster crowing before 8 a.m., unauthorized livestock, goats, cows, and chickens not permitted under community guidelines, failure to comply, cease and desist all non-compliant activities within 7 days, or face legal action. Luke burst out laughing right there on his porch, nearly spilling his coffee. The audacity was impressive. They had no legal grounds to enforce any of this, yet they were bold enough to put it in writing. Instead of replying, he tacked the letter onto his fridge like a trophy and went about his day. Then the real trouble started. Over the next week, he noticed strange cars parked near his property at odd hours. At first, he thought it was just nosy HOA members, but then he spotted a drone hovering over his land. Someone was watching him. One evening, as he was loading hay into the barn, he caught the culprit, a man in a black SUV, camera in hand, taking pictures from just outside the fence line. Luke set down the hay bale and strode over, calling out, "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The man looked up, startled, then tried to play it cool. "Just, checking on a local property dispute." Luke snorted. "Yeah, and who sent you?" The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before muttering, "Evergreen Estates, HOA." Luke smirked. He had figured as much. "Tell Olivia to stay the hell off my land." The man left in a hurry, but that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, Luke found something new waiting for him, an enormous for sale sign planted at the edge of his property. Beneath it, a second sign read, "Under negotiation, coming soon, Evergreen Estates expansion." Luke stared at it, his blood boiling. They were actually trying to claim his land. Furious, he ripped the sign out of the ground and stomped back to his house, dialing the HOA office. No answer, no surprise there. An hour later, Olivia pulled up in her pristine white SUV, stepping out with a smug expression. "I see you noticed the sign," she said sweetly. Luke folded his arms. "You want to explain why the hell it's on my land?" "Oh, it's just a simple misunderstanding," she chirped. "We've been in discussion about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some realtors assumed your farm was included in the new development and placed the sign prematurely." Luke narrowed his eyes. "So let me get this straight. A real estate agency just mistakenly put a for sale sign on my land completely by accident." Olivia's smile wavered. "Well, perhaps there was some enthusiasm." Luke shook his head. "You're insane if you think you can just claim my land and hope I won't notice." She sighed dramatically. "We just want to make the community a better place." Luke took a slow step forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put this sign up and tell them to never step foot on my property again. Because if I see another one, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing your entire HOA for fraud." Olivia paused. "Mr. Reynolds, let us not be hasty. I can also get the county involved if you'd like," Luke added, pulling out his phone. Her lips pressed into a thin line with an angry huff as she spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV. Luke watched her go, shaking his head. She wasn't done, and neither was he. Luke had always been a patient man, but patience only went so far. Olivia and her HOA had crossed the line, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. He didn't want war, but if that's what they were looking for, he was more than happy to give them one. The first thing he did was address the rooster complaint in the most satisfying way possible. If Olivia and her HOA friends thought one rooster was a problem, they were about to have a real issue. The very next day, he drove into town and came back with 3 new roosters, each one louder than the last. By the following morning, Evergreen Estates had a 5 a.m. symphony of crowing that echoed through the pristine neighborhood. It wasn't illegal. His farm was agricultural land, and roosters were well within his rights. There was nothing the HOA could do but stew in their frustration. But Luke didn't stop there. Since Olivia had such a problem with his barn being an eyesore, he decided to enhance the view. He planted an entire field of sunflowers along the property line, directly facing Evergreen Estates. Within weeks, a towering wall of bright yellow blooms stood between his farm and the HOA's perfectly manicured lawns. Homeowners who once had an unobstructed view of rolling fields now saw nothing but a sea of sunflowers blocking their perfect scenery. The complaints started pouring, and almost immediately, Olivia stormed onto his property one afternoon, clipboard in hand, waving another violation letter. "This is an obstruction," she snapped, glaring at the flowers. "It disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood." Luke leaned against his fence, chewing on a piece of straw. "It's a crop," he said lazily. "Perfectly legal. Thought you'd prefer flowers over an ugly old barn." Her jaw clenched. "This is petty." Luke grinned. "No more petty than finding people for mailbox colors." Her face turned red, but she knew she couldn't argue. Sunflowers weren't against any zoning laws. Furious, she stomped away, muttering under her breath. But the real masterpiece of Luke's revenge came a few weeks later. He had an old friend, Mark, who ran the local farmers market, and together they came up with an idea that would drive Olivia absolutely insane if the HOA did. Luke put up flyers all over town for a brand new event, Farmers Fun Day. Free entry, bring the kids, come meet the animals, fresh produce, live music, and more. The event was a massive success. Families poured in, kids ran around petting goats, and local musicians played live country music well into the afternoon. The best part? The crowd was so big that cars lined up all along the streets leading into Evergreen Estates. The entire day was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue. Olivia arrived in a rage, storming into the middle of the event, arms flailing. "This is a disturbance," she shrieked. "This is a residential area. You can't just turn your farm into a public attraction." Luke crossed his arms, grinning. "Actually, I can. I checked the county laws. My property is zoned for agricultural tourism." He gestured around him. "This is all perfectly legal." Her eye twitched. "But the noise, the traffic, all legal, county approved," he said smugly. "People love it." She turned to the crowd, expecting to find allies, but the Evergreen Estates residents were buying produce, laughing, and enjoying the event. Even some of the HOA members were happily shopping for farm-fresh eggs and honey. Realizing she had lost this battle, Olivia let out a frustrated noise and stormed away. The Farmers Fun Day was such a success that Luke decided to make it a weekly event. Every Saturday, his farm became the place to be. More vendors joined, the crowds grew, and the HOA's worst nightmare had officially come to life. Olivia had tried to make Luke's farm a problem. Instead, he had turned it into a town-wide celebration, and he wasn't done yet. The Farmers Fun Day had been a success, but Olivia wasn't about to admit defeat. If anything, the weekly crowds gathering at Luke's farm only fueled her rage. The HOA wasn't just losing control of the situation. They were losing control of their own residents. More and more people from Evergreen Estates were showing up, buying produce, petting the farm animals, and even enjoying the live music. The neighborhood's once strict loyalty to the HOA was starting to crack, and Olivia knew it. That's when she decided to escalate. Luke woke up one morning to find a massive, professionally printed for sale sign planted in his field. Right beneath it was another sign that read, "Future site of Evergreen Estates expansion under negotiation." Luke stared at it, barely able to believe the audacity. They weren't just harassing him anymore. They were trying to claim his land. Fuming, he yanked the sign out of the ground and tossed it in his truck bed before driving straight into town. He stormed into the county clerk's office, slammed the sign onto the counter, and demanded to know if there had been any legal filings regarding his property. The clerk, an older woman named Rita, pulled up the records and shook her head. No pending sales, no boundary disputes, nothing. Someone's trying to play games. Luke wasn't surprised. Olivia must have hoped to scare him into selling by making it look like his land was already in the process of being taken. But if she thought he would back down that easily, she had another thing coming. That same afternoon, Olivia showed up, her usual smug confidence plastered across her face. "I see you noticed the sign," she said sweetly. Luke leaned against his truck, arms crossed. "I also noticed that you and your HOA don't have a damn claim to my land." She smiled tightly. "It's just a preliminary discussion. The community is growing, and naturally, we want to explore expansion opportunities." Luke narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me a real estate agency accidentally put a sign on my farm and declared it part of Evergreen Estates without my permission?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before regaining her composure. Perhaps there was some enthusiasm about the idea. Luke chuckled darkly. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call whoever put up that sign and tell them that if I see another one, I'll be filing a fraud complaint with the county and a harassment lawsuit against your entire HOA. Olivia stiffened. There's no need for legal threats. He pulled out his phone. Then I guess you won't mind if I get the county involved just to clarify things. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Fine, she snapped before spinning on her heel and marching back to her SUV. Luke thought that would be the end of it, but he had underestimated just how desperate she had become. 2 days later, he noticed a drone flying over his property, circling suspiciously near his barn and house. He stood on his porch watching as it hovered lower, almost as if it were looking for something specific. That's when he noticed the black SUV parked just outside his property line. Someone was taking pictures. Luke grabbed his shotgun, not to fire, just to make a point, and marched straight toward the road. Hey, he called out. You want to explain why you're spying on my land? The man behind the camera froze before hurriedly tucking his camera into his bag. Just conducting a property assessment, he muttered. Luke smirked. Yeah, and who sent you? The man hesitated before sighing. Luke laughed, shaking his head. Tell Olivia next time she wants pictures, she can ask like a normal person instead of hiring a damn private investigator. That night, another letter arrived, this one claiming new violations. According to the HOA, his property was now guilty of unsanitary animal conditions, unauthorized commercial activity, and visual disturbances. It was clear what was happening. Olivia had hired someone to dig up dirt on him, hoping to find anything that could be used against him. But she had made a crucial mistake. Luke was always 2 steps ahead. The next morning, he marched straight into the HOA's monthly board meeting, completely uninvited. The room went silent as he walked to the front and dropped a thick folder onto the table. Abel crossed his arms. You've been harassing me, trespassing on my land, and now hiring people to spy on me, he said, his voice calm but firm. That's legal surveillance, and this, he tapped the folder, is a cease and desist order from my lawyer. If you don't stop immediately, I'll be suing the HOA for harassment, defamation, and illegal property interference. Olivia's face turned red. That's a ridiculous accusation. Luke smirked. Really? Because I have security footage of your private investigator snooping around, and this, he pointed at the documents, is a formal complaint filed with the county. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. Some of them looked at Olivia with suspicion, as if realizing for the first time that she had dragged them into something dangerous. The HOA president, a quiet man named Gerald, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should reconsider our approach. Olivia turned to him in disbelief. Gerald, you can't be serious. I think Mr. Reynolds is right, he said slowly. The HOA has no jurisdiction over his farm, and if he's prepared to take legal action, we should avoid making this worse. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Some of the board members have been uneasy about Olivia's crusade for weeks, and now faced with actual legal threats, they were no longer willing to back her up. For the first time, Olivia looked nervous. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the damage was done. The HOA was turning against her. Luke smirked, glad we could finally agree on something. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, knowing that Olivia's days in power were numbered. Word spread fast. By the next day, the entire neighborhood was buzzing about what had happened at the HOA meeting. Olivia, the once untouchable queen of Evergreen Estates, had finally been challenged, and by an outsider, no less. The homeowners who had lived under her rule for years were suddenly realizing something important. She wasn't as powerful as she made herself out to be. The cracks in her control had been forming for a while, but now they were too big to ignore. Luke didn't have to do much after that. The HOA was unraveling all on its own. Residents who had silently resented Olivia for years began speaking up. Complaints that had once been whispered in private were now being aired out in public. A group of homeowners, led by a woman named Martha, started collecting signatures for an official vote to remove Olivia from the HOA board. It didn't take long. Within days, more than half the community had signed. Olivia had lost her grip, and she knew it. But she wasn't going down without a fight. She tried to regain control, calling for an emergency meeting, attempting to convince the board that they needed strong leadership to handle the farm problem. This time, no one was buying it. Gerald, the HOA president, shut her down immediately. "We've had enough legal threats to last a lifetime. We're not wasting HOA funds on a personal vendetta." The other board members nodded in agreement. Olivia was outnumbered that night. A final vote was held, and the results weren't even close. Olivia was officially removed from her position as HOA enforcer. The neighborhood had turned against her, and for the first time, she had no power left to wield. Luke wasn't at the meeting, but he got a text from Martha that night. Just 2 words, "It's over." The next morning, a for sale sign appeared in Olivia's yard. Word around town was that she wasn't just leaving the HOA. She was moving out of Evergreen Estates entirely. Whether she left on her own or was quietly pressured by the remaining board members didn't really matter. What mattered was that she was gone. Luke couldn't have asked for a better ending. To mark the occasion, he had a brand new sign made and placed right at the edge of his property, facing Evergreen Estates. It read in bold black letters, "Welcome to Reynolds Farm, HOA free since 1923. It quickly became a local landmark. People from all over town came by to take pictures next to it. Even some of the former HOA members, now free from Olivia's rule, started visiting his Farmers Fun Day, buying fresh produce and enjoying the very farm she had tried so hard to get rid of. As for Olivia, the last thing Luke heard was that she had moved to another HOA-run neighborhood in a different town, thinking she could work her way back into a position of authority. But karma wasn't done with her just yet. That community already had an HOA president just as strict and power-hungry as she had been. Within a month, Olivia found herself on the receiving end of the very same rules she had once enforced on others. Her grass was half an inch too high, she was fined for parking too close to the curb, and when she tried to push for a leadership role, she was shut down immediately. By the time Luke heard about it, her house was already back on the market. Poetic justice at its finest. With Olivia gone, peace returned to Evergreen Estates and, more importantly, to Luke's farm. The difference was immediate. The ridiculous violation letters stopped arriving, the county inspectors no longer showed up unannounced, and the once tense atmosphere around the neighborhood had completely shifted. Without Olivia breathing down their necks, the residents of Evergreen Estates finally relaxed. Yards that had once been micromanaged to perfection now had a bit more personality. Kids rode their bikes without fear or complaints, and people no longer had to worry about getting fined for something as trivial as leaving their trash cans out an hour too long. Luke continued his life as usual, but with a little extra satisfaction knowing that his farm, once labeled an eyesore, had now become something the town celebrated. His weekly Farmers Fun Day had grown so popular that it became a permanent event. What started as a petty act of revenge had turned into a full-scale farmers market, drawing visitors from nearby towns and local vendors. Fresh produce, homemade jams, and handcrafted goods were being sold. Even some of the former HOA members became regulars, happily buying eggs and vegetables from the very farm Olivia had once tried to destroy. One afternoon, a small group from Evergreen Estates showed up at his farm carrying a basket of baked goods. Leading them was Martha, one of the most vocal HOA members who had pushed for Olivia's removal. She handed him a homemade pecan pie and smiled. "We figured we owed you a proper apology," she said. Luke raised an eyebrow. "An HOA trying to make peace? Never thought I'd see the day." Martha chuckled. "Let's just say things are a little different now that Olivia's gone." A man named Ted, one of the quieter HOA members, scratched the back of his head. "Honestly, Luke, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We didn't want to end up on Olivia's hit list." Luke nodded, understanding all too well how fear could keep people silent. "Fair enough," he said, taking a bite of the pie. "It was good, damn good. So what happens now?" Martha shrugged. "No more fighting, no more HOA nonsense. We'd rather be good neighbors than enemies." Luke considered that for a moment. "As long as no one tries to annex my land again, I think we can call a truce." They all laughed, and just like that, years of hostility started to fade. But the best part was yet to come. A few weeks later, Luke heard some news that made his victory even sweeter. Olivia's attempt to start fresh in a new neighborhood had gone spectacularly wrong. She had moved into another HOA community in a different town, thinking she could climb her way back into a leadership position. What she didn't realize was that this HOA already had an enforcer, someone just as strict and power-hungry as she had been. Within a month, Olivia found herself buried under violation notices for the very same petty infractions she had once used against others. Her grass was too tall, her car was parked at the wrong angle, and she was fined for putting up decorations that didn't meet the HOA's strict guidelines. When she tried to take charge, hoping to gain power like she had before, she was swiftly shut down. The HOA had no interest in giving her control. By the time Luke heard about it, Olivia's new house was already up for sale again. He couldn't have scripted a better ending. One evening, he sat on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching the sun set over his fields. His farm was thriving, the community was finally at peace, and Olivia had finally gotten what she deserved. He glanced at the sign by his property line, the one that had quickly become a town landmark. "Welcome to Reynolds Farm, HOA free since 1923. Luke smirked and took another sip of coffee. Karma had done exactly what it was supposed to.